of our presentations today for the Groundwater Drinking Water Trust Fund. First of all, welcome to, if you haven't been here before, the Department of Environmental Services. We share this building with Health and Human Services. I'm Bob Scott, Commissioner with the Department of Environmental Services. So I wanted to thank you all for your interest. These are important things being considered and a great opportunity. So I'm glad you're able to come. I also want to thank, there's not as many as there were this morning, but we had a trust fund commission meeting this morning. We have, I think the only one I'm seeing in the audience is Rick Russman. I want to thank the trust fund commission members for their work and the staff at DES. So what you're going to see presented is hopefully something that goes on for a long time, but also a lot of work went into getting us to this point. So again, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your interest. Source water protection is a key component of the statute that sets out the trust fund, and we want to make sure that we're following and being able to do projects that make a lot of good sense, and hopefully to leverage. You'll see a lot of talk about leveraging some projects to get a better bang for the buck for our environment and the citizens of New Hampshire. So the biggest goal today is to get questions answered, so please do not be bashful. For those of you who, like I, have a short attention span or don't remember things well, these are being recorded and will be on the internet, so you can revisit these if you need to. If you know people who weren't able to make it or find out about this after the fact and wish they could see that, that's a place they could go to hopefully get the same questions answered that you're seeing live. So with that, I'm going to introduce Clark Friese. He's our Assistant Commissioner. I've been doing a lot of work on this front, and I will say the state and the department is very lucky to have him, as well as all of our talented staff. So thanks.
Good afternoon, and it's nice to see a bunch of faces back from some of the stakeholder meetings. At one of the stakeholder meetings, I asked a question. I want to repeat it here. How many people are associated with a drinking water system source, or the drinking water side is where you're from? How many of you are from land conservation focus? Ratio's getting closer. Felt like we had to do speed dating and get you guys to know each other. So now we'll talk about why I care about that. So we're here to talk about the trust fund. We'll also go a little bit over the MTBE settlement funds, because sometimes there's confusion between what those are. But the money you're most interested in, if you're on the conservation side, is the trust fund. This is created by SB 380, which Senator Morse had a ton to do with. And it was basically taking a look. We had a lawsuit against ExxonMobil. They lost, they lost, they lost, they lost. They went to the Supreme Court, they lost. And they finally had to pay up. And it was about $330 million. Which by the time you strip off lawyers' fees and the rainy day fund is still $270 million, which is nothing to sneer at. They wanted to set up a trust fund and actually hold that money to be used with the drinking water and groundwater of the state. Obviously, contamination from MTBE is a primary concern, but what else are we doing? They set up the way to do that spending and look at how to do it was to set up an advisory commission, which the commissioner and I are also members of. And the commission sat down and talked about it and set a couple of basic goals. What do we really want to do? And one of the things was we don't want to spend it all at once. We'd like this money to be available over a time period because we'll have good ideas through time. And one of the models they really focused on was LCHIP. And what they looked at there is, here you got this pot of money. It's not huge, but it's a nice pot of money. And it leverages itself out into a huge number of projects over a long period of time that have a very broad impact on the quality of life in the state. And we'd like to do that. A lot of it's focused on construction. We've got systems where they've got contamination in the water, and getting piped fresh, clean water into that area is a big deal. But it's also, and this was one of the nice things because we set up a subcommittee to try and sharpen some of these things up, and the subcommittee is very focused. Part of what we're dealing with is contamination because we didn't protect the source of water. So it wouldn't be great to go out and buy some green infrastructure and protect our source before we have to put pipes in the ground to bring water from another town. And so one of the real focuses has been, what's the right way to do that and how do we get that focused? We did have a number of stakeholder input sessions, which I appreciate. As I said, I recognize some of the faces from the one I was able to attend. came up with an idea of how this should get done, at least this first year. And these rules, similar to LCHIP rules, will get changed through time as we find better ways to do it. But those were presented in March and accepted by the commission, and they're how we're going to run this year at least. And there are a number of goals. As I said, one of them was we want to maximize the impact of these trust funds. $270 million sounds like a lot of money until you start talking about what are our wastewater, drinking water, and water storage dam risks around the state and costs. And we have billions of dollars of needs, and we got $270 million bucks. So you got to figure out how to stretch that money if you want to solve a large chunk of the problems. It's not so applicable to you, but so you understand some of the framework of how we're doing things, we have a state revolving fund program that funds a lot of the water infrastructure in the state. And protecting that program is very, very important, because if and when the trust fund runs out of money, those revolving funds are the only money we have left to deal with our water infrastructure issues. So a lot of the discussion you may hear is about protecting the SRF program and prioritizing the SRF program. It's not that the other money isn't important, but that we get federal dollars every year into that, and so it's a nice growing pool of money. One of the things that was really stressed was the idea of loans versus grants. Now, this is less applicable on the conservation side, but did want to put out the idea that if it takes a little bit of a loan to get to the point you can get the grant, loans are available. And so it's a little bit different. In talking to Digit, they never have had that ability. We do. So as you approach a partner, and especially from the standpoint, if you're working with a water system, it may be for them to go get their loan and their grant for infrastructure. Part of how they're going to get points on their application is by showing they have a source conservation program that's active and funded. They may be willing to take a small loan for you to help get the grant. So we're trying to make sure everybody's looking at things perhaps in a little bit more novel way than it's been done before, because how we combine these things may make them more attractive projects. Big thing is, and this is where stakeholder input does not match with what we're doing. A lot of the stakeholder input was tell us exactly how this gets scored, exactly what I'll get for a grant, and exactly how it's going to get evaluated. And the commission has said no. The commission wants to have a tremendous amount of flexibility that when you put in an input and recommend a project, they can evaluate it and they can make the determination. So a lot of this input as far as wanting quantified, simple to understand guidelines, at least this year, that's not how it's going to get done. As far as the funding, there was an initial formula that we were going to take 20% of whatever's in the trust fund and make that in play every year. Out of that, 50% would go to grants, 40% would go to loans, and 10% would be pulled aside for non-construction projects. And the focus there was really on source protection, but also maybe in more novel studies or things that need to be done, training and education, especially education as far as the value of source protection, the value of clean, safe water in the state. Those are all thoughts that were put into that 10%. So in this coming year, we're talking roughly $5 to $5.5 million will be available for non-construction projects, with source preservation being the primary thought. So another one of the big things that came out of the subcommittee and then the commission was they really do like the LCHIP model, where for the last dollar on the table, another 7 are brought to the problem. And again, if you take $270 million, multiply it times 7, you actually get to the billions of dollars that we need to go solve our water problems in the state. So we'd love to get there. And the grants that were given last year at the beginning of this project, including the grants that were voted on this morning, we're not to a 7-to-1 ratio. We're at a 3-to-1. So it's not bad as a starting point, but the goal is to see if we can get there. So there really is this idea, where can money come from? What other sources could be brought to the table? And to some degree, how could the commission help out in doing that? So we can make the trust fund the piece that just gets it over the finish line. As I mentioned, non-construction, you can apply for loans. So if there is a need to get a little bit of a loan to get to a grant amount, that is available. The way this is going to work is that the commission will decide all grants. The commission is not limited in their decision making, but the commission wanted me to clearly communicate they do not intend to give a grant of more than 50% of a project, and they do not intend to give a grant of more than $500,000 on any given project. Again, they've kept full flexibility. If you find the perfect project that needed $600,000, they have the ability to do it, but they've made it pretty clear, and Rick can back me up, unlikely. They're really wanting to stick to 50% or less of the project and $500,000 or less in total dollars. The way this is going to go, and you'll see this in far more detail, but we're sort of saying things a couple of times because this is new. This actually is very similar to the LCHIP process. We will have an initial evaluation from your pre-applications. There will then be a review panel set up that will actually go walk the sites and get to know the projects. They will make an evaluation, and that is highly likely to be accepted by the commission. On the construction side, where there's a lot more economic development than other odd things that come into it, they're going to go a little differently. But the feeling on this side is this review panel is really going to look at the projects, walk the sites, get to know them, make a recommendation, and that's likely to be accepted by the commission, though they have full flexibility to decide all awards in the end by themselves. When that is done, DES will then take over and administer the awards and loans. We will run them through the usual process. Because of the way we're set up, there will be a time delay from a decision until a check, because we do not have a budget for this. There's a trust fund, but for us, DES, to get a budget, we have to go to the fiscal committee, get them to pull money out of the trust fund and give it to us. Once that's done, we then have to get a contract in place. Then that has to go to GNC and be accepted at GNC. So there's some time lags in there that are going to occur, and we want everybody to understand. Just because we show a timeline with a decision in October doesn't mean you get a check in October. Probably not till December, January, with the delays that go into it. So with that, I will hand off to Gary, who's going to give a little bit more background on the funds that have been there, how they got there.
Okay. My job is to tell you how we got to where we are today. And it starts for this particular program with the MTBE litigation. The MTBE litigation, if there was ever a story on why you need to have source water protection, it's MTBE. At one point in time in some of our counties, over 20% of the drinking water wells had MTBE contamination in them. It's a pretty staggering amount. And what it amounts to is certain chemical products are in widespread use in the state. And when something is in widespread use, there are many, many different ways for it to escape into the environment. Well, we noticed when we looked at the MTBE data statewide, and we had lots of it. In fact, we even had USGS work with us and randomly sample wells throughout the state to see the prevalence of MTBE contamination. And what we found out is it correlated very well with population density. It correlated very well with the existence of underground storage tanks and the density of underground storage tanks. And so when you think about it, the only way to protect really valuable drinking water sources and to truly protect them is to worry about what's in the source water area. If you don't do that, then something in widespread use has the opportunity to escape into the environment. And if it doesn't biodegrade well, it ends up in our drinking water sources and aquifers. So we had the MTBE litigation, and we settled with most of the defendants, all but one, and that created a settlement fund, which we still have $66 million in, and that we're using to address drinking water and groundwater problems, but they have to be MTBE related because of the settlement terms. We also had a trial because ExxonMobil did not settle, and that ended up with that large amount of money that Clark referenced and has now been deposited in the trust fund. We've only had that $280 million in the trust fund for a couple of years, and the advisory commission, the mechanism to figure out how to spend it, has only been in existence and really active since last fall. So a lot of progress has been made. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the settlement money, that's a separate piece of it because it really does impact efforts to protect drinking water sources in this state, particularly for MTBE. That program, the settlement money program, has been sampling assiduously drinking water wells in the state. It's been doing a variety of release prevention activities related to gasoline, which is one of the more toxic compounds that's obviously very readily available. It's been doing cleanups and has been developing drinking water remedies for contaminated sites. And this is sort of the accomplishments to date slide. Approximately 10,000 drinking water samples have been collected to date. Those have been analyzed for volatile organic contaminants, and that information has all been loaded up into our electronic database, providing a searchable GIS-linked capability so that we have a very good view and understanding of how VOC contamination might affect the state. We've done a lot of prevention activities. If you have a source water that you're trying to protect, and you have existing land uses that aren't using the best management practices to protect that source water, you can end up with problems. Like I said, tanks correlated well with contamination in drinking water supplies. And in actuality, we found a number of drinking water wells impacted by motor vehicle recycling facilities. So what we did for prevention and is ongoing for prevention activities is that we removed 260 underground gasoline storage tanks. Can't have a release from a tank system that no longer exists. So that's a good step towards prevention and a significant percentage of the underground storage tanks in the state. We purchased and provided to motor vehicle recycling facilities over 80 gasoline transfer devices to safely transfer fluids. And we've put in spill prevention pads at a number of these recycling facilities. Remediation, where we take out the source material, because if you have your gasoline contaminated soil still in place and continually leaching contaminants, it's an ongoing source that can affect your drinking water wells and aquifers. So taking out that concentrated material is a good first step for restoring an aquifer. The reason why you do source water protection instead of prevention and remediation is it's incredibly expensive to restore aquifers. It's one of the most difficult things you can try to accomplish. It's much better to protect the source and not have to restore the aquifers. It can take decades, it can take up to millions of dollars in order to restore an aquifer that is contaminated. So that's why we're here, to figure out how to protect our vital drinking water sources in the state. And this program has also done some infrastructure projects. So just to give you an idea of what kind of sampling capabilities we have and have been using with this program, what we do is we create sampling districts. There's a there's a dry cleaner site, and there's also a gas station lease site in the middle of this area. And essentially that entire shaded area was a sampling district, and we collected samples from almost the entire, almost all the lots. Some were undeveloped, of course. Some didn't participate, but participation overall was very high. And what we found out is the groundwater contamination in the bedrock aquifer did not go where you expected it to go. It seemed like it should be flowing all this way, but we found out that this particular aquifer, it went in a complete opposite direction of where you expected it. So we collected a lot of data, and we found out and reinforced the notion that when you have an unprotected aquifer and you have potential land uses where you can have releases, that you can get serious consequences and sometimes unpredictable ones. Another source water protection pitch. Prevention activities. this gives you an idea of some of the kind of activities that might not be compatible with your drinking water source. In this case, oops, sorry. This is vehicle dismantling, fluids handling on top of a thin layer of plastic, outdoors where wind can blow the gasoline released from when you remove the fluids, a whole bunch of containers that aren't really well secured. Some of these places might have open containers that if you get rainfall or get overtopped. Here's another example. The gasoline was drained into this makeshift device in the past. You can see in a windy day, it ends up on the ground. So what are we doing? What we did is we provided this piece of equipment, which actually the owner loves because it evacuates the gas tank much faster than he would do by gravity draining it. He loves it because it's got dual filters up here so that the gasoline comes out of the cars, is immediately filtered, and then put in a tank where he just slides the switch and he can pump it direct into some of the cars that he owns. So it makes it easier to reuse the gasoline. It makes it less likely to spill, because in addition to this, there's a drill setup that he uses that is gasketed and connects directly to the tanks. Much better system. Instead of doing it on the ground like this, we've gone and worked with this owner to put in a nice impermeable concrete spill pad. Vast improvement in the best management practices. So we're doing a lot. But the trust fund, that allows us to do so much more. There's a new statute that governs it, RSA 45F, and that statute has a very broad scope. It allows spending of this money on infrastructure, drinking water source protection, mapping of contamination, emergency remedial actions. It really provides ability to integrate a variety of different types of programs to protect, to restore New Hampshire's drinking water aquifers and drinking water sources. That statute establishes an advisory commission. Former Senator Russman's a member. And that commission is responsible for the funding decisions and the program vision. I think that's a very important thing. There's 2 senators, 2 state reps on it. I think that is a smart way of establishing an advisory commission, because if the program needs to be tweaked over time, there's bill sponsors, there are people that understand the legislature and can make sure this program runs as well as it can possibly run. So that's a very important thing. That 19-member advisory commission is chaired by Senate President Morris, which shows you how important this is to the state and the value that they've been putting on it. In the short term, the advisory commission approved grants and loans for some time-critical projects. In the long term, what they've done is they've established the rules and procedures for this ongoing annual future funding rounds from the trust fund. Incredible accomplishments from starting essentially in September of last year to this point in time. The short-term goals, the commission approved $35 million in projects. Amazing. And the long-term goal, we're here today on the workshop for getting that application process going. And we have an operating budget now. So that's very briefly some of the projects that have been approved. I think one of the important things is even in the initial round, there was a source water protection project approved and grant money provided. So the advisory commission understands source water protection is an important thing to fund. and demonstrated that by already funding a project. This is just a reminder. These are where the projects have been approved to date. It's a statewide program. We want to help everyone in the state that has crucial drinking water and source water protection needs. And finally, I want to reinforce just how rapid the progress has been. Out of the grants that were approved, $10 million worth have already been physically awarded. There's a few that are still in the process, but that's very fast progress. And in fact, Northumberland has received a disbursement, the first disbursement for a grant, so their project is complete. So between September and now, we have a completed grant project. We've also extended loans, and as of today, $1.75 million in loan money has been dispersed for an infrastructure project. And finally, although we've done all this work, this trust fund, it's being invested. It's making $300,000 a month in investment income. And when the loan repayments start kicking in, it will have even greater income on an annual basis. So we've dispersed money, but because of the investment income, we're not really in the hole yet. So we're still in the black from the original deposit from ExxonMobil 2 years ago. So I'd like to conclude and introduce the next speaker, who's Paul Suska. Oh, yeah, I can take some questions, sure.
What's the current procedure for the remediation of the MTBE soil?
What we're doing now is we've got a reimbursement process in place. And so we pre-approve work scopes and budgets if we find that there is a gasoline source area with MTBE that needs to be addressed. Approve the work scope and budget, and then we reimburse the cost to the municipality or private individual or whoever that conducts the cleanup. So it allows us to move pretty fast because it's a reimbursement process.
Keep taking questions.
Sure.
Yeah, what's the term of the loans? You give the loans, how long are they going for?
It's my understanding that the loans can be all the way up to 40 years, and but that has to be an asset that will be present 40 years from now. I imagine if you're protecting land, that would be something that would be around. Additionally, the interest rate, it'd probably be in the neighborhood of 2 to 3%. It's based on market conditions at the time.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Great. I think oh, I'm very sorry. I missed you.
How does this, well, the brownfields program, is this somehow related or working together, or is that totally separate?
Actually, our state may be unique in that the drinking water and the waste management remedial programs actually work very closely together. And the settlement money and the trust fund brought us together like no other state that I can think of. Because if my program is extending a water line to address MTBE contaminated wells using our source of funding, we still need to have the drinking water program support in reviewing the project and approving the plans, as well as their sage advice into what is good infrastructure, what is something that's forward-looking and satisfies the needs currently and the future. So yeah, we work together very closely, and it's my privilege to work with those guys, you know, Rick and Jana and Paul and Sarah. Well, I could name everybody in the program. That would take some time. So, thanks.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the grants for land conservation projects. And before I start, I just want to, for the benefit of those who were watching on GoToMeeting, there were 4 handouts. Everybody, you all have them in your folders here, but those who are watching online, there's 4 handouts that are pretty important. And I'm just going to walk you quickly through how to obtain those online. Actually, just go ahead and take a screenshot of this page. And the first thing you want to do is search for NHDWG Trust Fund. You'll find the website, the home page for the trust fund. In the lower right, go to recent posts and select Loans and Grants Workshop. And then on the left side, you'll see a link for a PDF to the One-Stop Data Mapper handout, which again, everybody has here. And then there are 3 other documents you can get on the home page, or I think any of the pages. The applicants and recipients tab can be pulled down and go to the non-construction projects link, and all 3 documents on that link are important today. Today is a great day. We're kicking off this great program. Great things are already being accomplished. You heard about some of the projects that have already been funded. And so it really kind of invents comparisons with other great achievements in the history of water supply. There's a fellow named Sextus Julius Frontinus, who was, among many things, he was a soldier, he was a politician, he was governor of Roman Britain for a while. He was a civil engineer and superintendent of the aqueduct system back home in Rome. He wrote 2 books. That's the reason why we're bringing him up, is he wrote 2 books about the aqueduct system. And so we know a lot about how the system works, and also his thoughts on such topics as source water protection. He made the observation that the further the source is from the waters, that is, I think what he's saying is the bigger the watershed, the more difficult it is to have a clean source. And I think I'd agree with that. And he also had a lot of observations about the quality of some of the different sources that were being used, one of them being the Anio River. And he noticed that because there was little cultivated land in the hamlet, and also, so he noticed the importance of land cover, particularly the shade of the forests, also helped keep that source protected. So hats off to Frontinus. Fast forwarding to the Jamestown settlement. This is going to take me all afternoon. And so this is in what is now Virginia. Governor Gage, back in 1610, he issued a proclamation, very broad proclamation, dealing with a lot of pressing issues of the day, one of them being source water protection. And he basically established a sanitary protective radius of about 20 feet from the well, during which you couldn't clean anything and dispose of the water there. And he established a wellhead protection area of 1/4 mile from the fort. In that area, you're not allowed to do any of the necessities of nature, so that the fort would not be choked and poisoned. All right, I'm going to just jump right to today. Now, don't worry. Today's source water protection is really an integral part of the overall strategy of operating any water system. There's still a handful of water systems in the state that aren't doing an awful lot in the area of source water protection, but at this point, it's really a bedrock doctrine of the water supply profession, the multiple barrier approach. And that begins with selecting the cleanest source, as Frontinus would have us do, and protecting it from contamination. So treatment and testing and all that other stuff is no substitute for having a clean source to begin with. And Gary mentioned source water protection a number of times. I just want to point out there's a whole range of tools that are involved in source water protection, from the most protective, land conservation and protective zoning, to some of the less protective measures, but you have to do what's appropriate in each situation. The important thing as we make use of all of the source water protection tools that are available to us. And up till now, we haven't really been able to make much use of the land conservation option. We have not had a consistent, reliable source of funding that's dedicated to protecting water supply lands. It appears that we now do. As far as the reasons for protecting water supply lands, I don't think I need to spend much time explaining how forest cover and natural land cover helps, what the mechanisms are in terms of protecting land. But I think in addition to filtering and capturing pollutants, the key thing is if it's protected, you can't locate any new pollution sources there. And that actually translates into economics, the dollars and cents of source water protection, and in particular, water supply land protection and water quality. There's a study done by the Trust for Public Land and American Water Works Association a number of years ago, and they compared a number of watersheds, water supply watersheds across the country, and found that with a 10% increase in forest cover from one watershed to another, you tended to have a 20% decrease in water costs. So conversely, you lose 10% of your land cover, and you're looking at increased costs in the future. And it's not just dollars and cents. It means cleaner water at the source, and also means cleaner water at the tap. Treatment doesn't necessarily get everything out of the water. And there's been more and more research to support the economic argument for water supply land protection over the years. This particular article is from the 2014 Journal of the American Water Works Association. It looked at a number of case studies, and I won't go into detail on this today, but I think it's useful as a persuasive piece when you're promoting and raising funds for a land conservation project. But I would argue that there's a more compelling argument to make for water supply land protection besides the dollars and cents of the short-term avoided cost of treatment. And that is, if you look at the number of contaminants that have been regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act over the years, in the last 25 to 30 years, there's been a tremendous increase in the number of contaminants. And that's partially due to us becoming aware of the occurrence of these contaminants in water systems, but also improved analytical methods and new information on health effects. And so this list is likely to grow. And it's a little bit hard to be confident that the treatment system you're building today is going to be effective at all of the potential contaminants that might appear in the future. And so I think it's a prudent approach to keep the source water as clean as possible. And finally, while the built infrastructure, which is of course absolutely essential to any water system, built infrastructure has a finite lifespan. At some point it needs to be replaced, but land that's permanently protected is just that, it's permanent. And the financial calculations don't really place a value on that. So we can't just look at the dollars and cents when we're looking at the rationale for protecting water supply land. But I believe the public does understand that this is a wise thing to do to protect water supply land. And actually that's been borne out by surveys. There was a survey done a few years ago of likely voters in New Hampshire. The survey focused on different aspects of land conservation, and water quality protection ranked highest among the aspects of of land conservation that voters thought were either very important or somewhat important. The bad news is that right now, in the absence of a reliable, consistent funding source for water supply land, 76% of our high priority water supply lands in the state are unprotected, meaning that they're vulnerable to land use change in the future. That is that's 76%. But the trust fund is going to make it possible to change that, but it's up to you to develop the projects that are going to protect the important water supply lands. The good news is that the amount of money that's available under this program is really unprecedented. This shows over time the amount of money we've had available for water supply land protection. Back from 2001 to 2008, we had some funding under the Drinking Water Land Protection Grant Program, which Holly Green now runs. We've got a little bit of money left. So there was about $9 million over a 9-year period. And then there was nothing. And then we got some money from DOT, mitigation for the I-93 widening project. And that was about $3 million. So over 5 years, that was about $600,000 a year. Right now, we've got nothing. Well, wait a minute, we've got $5 million or so. So this is a fantastic opportunity. Now, you might not need to be convinced that there's a need to protect water supply lands, but I want you to know that the argument that I've been making this morning has been documented in this report. So this is just a source of information in your work, trying to persuade others to support the projects that you're developing to protect water supply lands. This was, again, it's not a plan. We started off with the aim of developing a water supply land protection plan for the state, and we'll be moving ahead with that this year with the involvement of the Advisory Commission and Senator Russman in particular. But last year what we did was produce this report, and it not just lays out the rationale for protecting land, but also how we went about identifying the high priority water supply land in the state. We actually had a couple of the statewide land conservation organizations came to us and said, you know, there's a lot of different water supply land layers, and I'll talk about that later on, and it can get pretty darn confusing. But, you know, there's the Wildlife Action Plan, which is really easy to understand. Everything's just mapped out. What we need is a Wildlife Action Plan for drinking water. And I said, okay, a WAP for drinking water, we'll call it a DO-WAP. I don't know, we might have to come up with a different name, but again, we'll see what the senator thinks. All right, so now I'm going to actually talk about this year's program. Projects that are eligible would be high priority water supply land and a couple of other categories that I'll get into. This map shows the statewide distribution of the high priority water supply lands that are currently unprotected and undeveloped. And it makes up about 9.5% of the state. In order to be eligible for the grants, the land has to be undeveloped and uncontaminated unless there is a plan to undevelop and uncontaminate it. And actually, we have talked to some people who have been looking at properties that are developed, and their intention is to go in and remove the development and restore it to an undeveloped state. Now, the grants are not available to do that undevelopment piece of it. The grants are available, however, to permanently protect the land. And again, it needs to be permanently protected. So land that is currently owned by a municipality, if it's not permanently protected, is eligible for funding, although there needs to be a compelling argument made that there's potentially some risk to that land being developed in the future. As I believe Clark mentioned earlier, the maximum is a 50% grant, so that means at least a 50% match, and projects will do better if they have more than that 50% match. And also later on today, we're going to be hearing from several folks who run some other programs that could be potential sources of match money. And there's a soft cap of a $500,000 maximum grant on any one project. In terms of eligible project costs, this is not news to those of you who do land protection, but the water suppliers might not be aware of this. In a land protection project, there are costs, sometimes significant costs, other than the cost of simply acquiring the land or the easement. And these are all eligible costs under this program. There's a bunch of legal and transaction costs, appraisal, survey, stewardship fee. So just want to let you know about those, and these can all be figured into the total project value, and they can also be part of the match. Sources of actual money for the match, the municipality. A lot of conservation commissions have some modest funds available for land conservation. Bargain sale, that means that the owner of the land is selling the easement or the property at less than market value. And so the difference between the sale price and the market value is actually a donation, which can be considered part of the match. And other properties that are eligible, that are donated, would also be considered match. And other grant programs, as I said. And we'll be hearing more about that later. Eligible applicants are water systems, municipalities, land trusts, and other conservation organizations. So here's how it's going to work. Today, we are starting to accept eligibility applications. If you look at your packet, there's just a single sheet, which is our 2-page eligibility application. It's pretty brief. I'm actually going to show you later on how to use our online GIS viewer so that you can pretty much determine whether or not your project is in an eligible area. So that eligibility application is really just for us to verify that indeed the project is eligible, and we intend to turn these around quickly, and we encourage folks to get these applications, in early so we can turn them around, and then you'll have more time to develop the full application, which will be due August 6th. And let me just back up and mention that the eligibility application is a requirement. You need to get the eligibility application in order to move on to the next step in the process. So after we get the full application in early August, we'll be doing a objective scoring. And as you probably can see in that guidelines document, there's some information about what the exact scoring criteria we're going to use. The DES staff is using, again, a completely objective scoring process. And after we go through that, we'll be working with the review panel, who will perhaps take some other things into account. And ultimately, it'll go to the commission that'll make the final funding decision. There's a couple of questions in the application that don't directly address the objective criteria, things like project readiness. And so that's an opportunity for you to make the best case you can. And so those are not things we'll be scoring objectively, but information we'll be passing along to the review panel and to the commission. All right, so getting down to some of the nuts and bolts of exactly what is eligible land. Okay, don't be overwhelmed. I'm going to just walk you through one little piece at a time here. As I said, there's a lot of different categories that could be considered water supply land. Starting with water supply watersheds. So those are the watershed areas that drain to an intake that's being used by a water system. But in New Hampshire, all of our major rivers are water supply rivers, and so that means that 70% of the state is in a water supply watershed. Okay, and that doesn't really pass the straight face test in terms of high priority water supply land. So working with the stakeholders that we brought together last summer to put together this report that I showed you earlier, we decided to focus in on the portions of the water supply watersheds that we had already identified as so-called hydrologic areas of concern, which are areas that tend to be closer to the intake. If it's a small watershed, sometimes it's the whole watershed. But if it's a large watershed, then it's some portion of it. And you'll see a map of that later on to just see a couple of examples. After you're taking out what's already conserved and what's already developed, the hydrologic areas of concern are 4.1% of the state. Next category, wellhead protection areas. Those are the areas that DES delineates, or often hydrogeological studies will do the delineation and we approve them. But these are all blessed by DES. The wellhead protection areas for wells that are being used by public water systems, community water systems, and non-transient water systems. The wells that they use all have wellhead protection areas. And so that's the area from which water is probably flowing to the well. And 6.5% of the state, and if we just look at the undeveloped, unprotected portion, it's another 4.5% of the state. The next category is stratified drift aquifers. If you've looked at any stratified drift aquifer map, you'll notice that it can be pretty extensive area. It's actually 12% of the state is mapped as stratified drift aquifer. These are sand and gravel and clay deposits that were laid down by glacial meltwater thousands of years ago. The advisory group we were working with decided that it made sense to narrow that down to high yield portions of those stratified drift aquifers. And that's 2.8%. And after, again, taking out the conserved or developed, we're left with 1.7%. And adding them all up, we've got 9.5% of the state. And if the numbers don't add up, it's because there's some overlap between some of these categories. So this is actually the easiest to view category of eligible land, the high priority water supply lands. So looking at what are the other categories, anything that's currently eligible or anything that's eligible under our current Water Supply Land Protection Grant Program, which many of you are familiar with, is also eligible. So that means that if it's in a water supply watershed and it's within 5 miles of the intake, it's eligible. If it's in a water supply watershed and it has riparian frontage that is ultimately a tributary to the source, then these are a little bit more complicated to view, and I'll give you an abbreviated version of how to look at these things in the data mapper. Finally, in the interest of being flexible, we created a third category and said, well, if the municipality or the water system has gone through a methodical process of identifying high priority water supply lands for protection, and it passes a straight face test, then that land would be eligible as well. I really expect that almost everything, if not everything in that category, is going to fall into one of the other categories anyway, but the idea was to have the maximum amount of flexibility. So here we have the data mapper. So there's a handout on this, and you might want to follow along with me. You can find the one-stop data mapper. Well, you can search for NHDES one-stop data mapper, or you can use the URL that's in your handout. First thing you do is click on the globe, and that brings you here. Now, ever since 9/11, the locations of public water supply sources, the wells and the intakes, has been considered sensitive information. And so we created a process where you need to first obtain a PIN and password in order to access that information. So the first time you go in, if you don't already have a PIN and password for this application, you click on that link and then you'll apply for it. And then hopefully within a few days, you'll be assigned a PIN and password. Next time you go in, you just log in here. And then that will bring it to the viewer itself. And you'll select, I want to view map layers. And then you'll need to log in again. Then you'll be viewing the map. Now this is showing in the blue hatched area, those are the water supply watershed, water supply watershed areas are also called source water protection areas. And this is the whole state. And as you can see, part of just about all of Vermont. And I just wanted to make the point that it's a very extensive area. It's 70% of the state. And then there's the little green areas in there are wellhead protection areas, which you don't need to look at individually because wellhead protection areas are included in the high priority water supply lands layer. Zooming in a little bit here, this is showing the source water protection areas, that is the water supply watersheds and the hydrologic areas of concern. So pointing out just a couple of those here. The one that's on the top is the hydrologic area of concern for the Kentucky River. And then the one on the right, that's the HAC for the Merrimack River. And then you can see some of the other darker areas are HACs for some of the other surface water sources. Again, you don't have to look for HACs because it's included in the high priority water supply lands layer. This is what that looks like, the high priority water supply lands. So it includes the HACs, that is the hydrologic areas of concern, all of the wellhead protection areas, and the high yield stratified drift aquifer. But as I mentioned, there's some other watershed land that's also available. And what you'll do is you'll have to look at the source water protection area land coverage, and then see, is it within 5 miles of the intake or does it have riparian frontage? For your convenience, there's going to be a group. You've noticed that on the left-hand side, when you're looking at when you open up the viewer, there's sort of a legend, and you can use that legend to select which of the layers that you're going to view. And in the very near future, there's going to be a group that includes all three of those things. That is the source water protection areas and the hydrologic areas of concern, and one more thing. All right, we've created a 5 mile area. That is, we've carved out the bottom 5 miles of each of the source water protection areas so that you can see what's eligible. Moving on to the scoring criteria. So in a attachment 3 to the guidelines document. On page 4, there's this abbreviated version of the scoring criteria, and then attachment 3 to that guidelines document has the sort of exploded version, the detailed version of how we'll be scoring each of the applications on each of these 16 criteria. You'll notice that these two account for a lot of the points, 6 and 7, proximity to the water supply well or intake, and frontage on rivers, streams, etc. So a project that is in a water supply watershed and has frontage, if it is far, far from the intake, it's not going to score as well as one that is close to the intake. However, this year with $5 million available, there's a possibility that all of the projects could potentially be funded. That'll be up to the commission to decide that. Another category that has a lot of points is value of match. Again, something that the commission wants to encourage, having an overmatch, more than the 50% minimum match. There's a few of these criteria, 3, 4, and 5, having to do with asset management, planning that's done by the water system, water conservation activities by the water system, and energy efficiency by the water system. So you're going to have to work with the water system to get this information and to make it part of your application. In terms of partnering, as Clark said, this is a speed dating opportunity this morning. For those of you who have not, the water systems who have not done these kinds of projects before, the land trusts and the local conservation commissions are your first candidates to be working with. This map is from the website of the New Hampshire Land Trust Coalition. So that's nhltc.org. You can look at that map, you can zoom in on it, and in any given municipality, you can see what are the land trusts that serve that area, and then you can go out and contact them. And land trusts and conservation commissions, you want to work with public water systems, and if you don't know who they are, I mean, sometimes it's obvious, you know who the municipal water systems are, but there's a lot of small non-municipal water systems too. There are some instructions in the data mapper handout that explain how you can use the data mapper to identify what are the water systems that correspond to the water supply lands, and then you can even find out who the contacts are. But again, if you really want to go and have fun doing that with the computer, be my guest. But if you don't, give us a call and we can help you figure that out. As an aside, I mentioned the existing water supply land protection grant program and the $3 million that we had available from DOT for mitigation associated with the I-93 widening. Of the original $3 million, there's some $48,000 left, and we'll be having one, we hope, final grant round this year. Same due dates as the program that we're talking about today, but the applications are very different. If you've ever dealt with this program, the eligibility application is the big application. That's where all of your work is going in. So as opposed to this program, which is just eligibility. So again, you'd have to fill out a different application form. Land that's eligible is limited to the I-93 impact corridor. It doesn't include all of the high priority water supply lands. This map gives you an idea of what is eligible. This is the watershed for Lake Massabesic. Okay, this is the watershed area for, I think, the Merrimack Pennachuck's intake on the Merrimack River. Does that seem right? Okay. Watershed area for Salem's surface water sources. In blue, the wellhead protection areas, and in green, a portion of the high yield stratified drift aquifers that we call favorable gravel well areas. Give us a call. All right, so when in Rome, do as the Romans do. When in New Hampshire, do as 99% of likely voters would have you do, and protect water supply lands. So now we've got some time to hear from folks from the other grant programs, and I think we'll start with Digit from the LCHIP, and Digit has been tremendously helpful to the commission and to us in putting together this program. and in helping us understand some of the fine points of running a grant program for land conservation.
Well, hi. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and fabulous to see some new and different people that the land conservation activists might be able to partner with. So I think that it's great that water supply people are taking an interest in this. As Paul said, I'm Digit Taylor. I have the privilege and honor of running the Land and Community Heritage Investment Program, fondly known as LCHIP. We are a matching grant program that provides money for both land conservation and historic preservation. We've been in place since the year 2000. At the moment, we're well-funded and are able to give out about $3.5 million a year. That goes both for land conservation and historic preservation. There's no specific division between the two kinds of projects, although usually a lot more money goes to land conservation and a lot more projects happen on the historic preservation side. Our money is eligible to be used as match for the new water supply money. So that's good news for those of you that are going to be looking for matching sources. We have a grant round about to open on May 1st. We're offering a workshop also on May 1st for how to write a successful LCHIP grant application. If you haven't attended one of those and you think you might be applying for funding in the upcoming grant round, you should be there, and you can find out how to register for that workshop on the LCHIP website, which is lchip.org. We have one grant round a year, and our applications will be due at the end of June, and our decisions will be made in the middle of November. So it's a longish period because we are very careful in visiting the sites and making sure that we see application sites and understand exactly what the applicant is trying to do. And when you get a grant from LCHIP, you don't just get handed a check. You have to complete the project to our satisfaction, and then you get the money when the document that ensures the permanent protection of the land in question is put in place. We like to say that LCHIP protects things that you love about New Hampshire, and we are eager to help any and all of you do good permanent land conservation in your community and in your water supply area. So that's really all you need to know about LCHIP. The rest you can find out on our website or by asking us. We answer the phone. We love to talk to you and hear more details about your potential projects. Any quick questions?
Thanks very much, Digit. And we'll have plenty of time for more questions later. In case you haven't already discovered them you found your way? Okay. In your folder, there's a handout from each of the other programs we're going to hear from this morning. And next we'll hear from Lori Summer talking about DES's Aquatic Resource Mitigation Program. And Lori's been doing this for, you didn't tell me how many years.
Close to 30.
Close to, okay, that's why.
A lot of years. Good afternoon. Walking in today, I saw a lot of familiar faces, just like Digit said. I see a few grant awardees, multiple grant awardees. I see a mitigation easement landowner here. So it's really good to have you all here. And like Paul said, what a great day. There's money. So I'm here to talk about the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Fund. It's a grant program set up within the DES Wetlands Bureau. So it's not an appropriation, a yearly appropriation, but it's driven by payments from development projects that reach a certain threshold. And as a mitigation option, they can provide a payment into the ARM fund. And those payments are pooled into the 9 different service areas. And then every other year, we're going to a every other year grant round process. We advertise those funds and then issue those monies out to land protection projects, wetland restoration projects, anything that has a significant component to protect wetlands, aquatic resources, streams, vernal pools. Who's eligible for ARM fund grants, similar to LCHIP and the trust fund, communities, land trusts, nonprofit organizations, universities, watershed associations, 501c3 organizations are all eligible to apply for ARM fund grants. We operate in close hand with the Army Corps of Engineers, because as a payment is provided, that developer or applicant is getting a permit that often involves state and federal impacts. So we have an oversight committee of the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the NRCS. So they are part of our team to administer these grant funds. We also work with a site selection committee, which is made up of 4 state agencies, as well as 5 nonprofit organizations. So it's a big team that put their heads together and look at these projects closely. They help, I work with them to develop evaluation criteria for how to administer the funds. It's a great group of folks. I actually see one committee member here, Brian Hotz, is on the site selection committee. So we're looking at projects, like I said, that involve land conservation or a combination of land protection and restoration. So wetland restoration. We also get involved with culvert replacements. We've just really improved our program to focus on stream crossing improvements for aquatic organism passage. We also get involved with dam removals. Anyone here from Exeter? The great dam was just recently removed. We help fund that. As well as we're getting into living shoreline projects, as well as oyster reef restoration. So a broad range of habitat improvement and protection projects. We are just entering our 2018 grant round. This year we have close to $6 million available across the state. Some of the bigger pools of funds are in the southern part of the state, in the lower Connecticut region. You can see the amount of fundings on this handout. 2.6 million in this watershed, in the Merrimack River watershed, and over in the coast, $1.2 million eligible. We have all the application materials on our website. We call it a pre-proposal, not an eligibility, but a pre-proposal. We want to know just what you're thinking about, so give us a quick and dirty snapshot, 1,000-word summary with a couple maps, location, a draft budget, and those are due April 30th. So I know this is a little short notice for this grant round, but if you do have a ready project, I would encourage you to put a pre-proposal in. I work with the committee, then we review those, get feedback to folks to improve the project or think of other things to incorporate or how to fine-tune the budget. Our full applications are due, of those pre-proposals that are invited back, the full application proposals are due August 31st. And that's when really the grant round for the committee kicks in. They'll be visiting the sites, sitting down with GIS data to look at these and analyze and evaluate the projects. And then typically we're getting back to applicants by November. Couple of last parting thoughts. The ARM Fund program does not require a match. I think that might bring a few smiles to faces. There's so many match requirements that people have to go through and jump, and thread a needle through. Our program does not require match, but as you can hear, these are expensive projects, so multiple funding sources are usually needed to piece a project together. There's no upper limit on ARM funded projects. We have funded $750,000 project. We've funded a $5,000 project. So there's no thresholds. And all our materials are on the web. I have a website here. All our new application materials are on there. And I would encourage you to check out a new tool that we just developed. It's the Aquatic Restoration Mapper. And you can, type that into Google or go to our website. It is a tool that you don't need a password, you don't need any GIS skills, but it has all the information that we would like to see for you to be able to compile your application materials to submit. It's got the WAP, it's got the stream information that we've been collecting, it's got other resources that I think you would find helpful to then compile information to make a strong ARM fund application. So good luck, and we'll take questions later. Thank you.
Take a few now.
Okay.
Any questions for Lori right now? Okay, so we'll take more later. Okay, and so next we're going to hear from Susan Francher talking about the Forest Legacy Program. Susan's the administrator of the Planning and Community Forestry at the Department of
Just rolls off your tongue, doesn't it?
Natural and Cultural Resources. How do you pronounce that?
DNCR.
DNCR, okay.
Our department is now new, Division of Forests and Lands.
Okay, and Susan's been with the Forest Legacy Program since 1992, so she knows all about it.
Okay. So we like to call the Forest Legacy Program the biggest land protection program in New Hampshire that you don't know about. Mostly because it's perceived as being something for folks who have big projects and expensive projects, maybe complicated projects, and there's a good reason for that. And so it was developed by the 1990 Farm Bill. It's for protection of forest land threatened by conversion to non-forest use. That's the purpose of the program. It is not quite statewide here in New Hampshire. We have almost all the land in New Hampshire under the program except kind of Manchester, Nashua East. So that kind of heavily developed and dense area in the southeast portion of the state is not eligible. You can find a map of the eligible areas at our website, NHDFL.org, sorry. And that website is at the bottom of my sheet. So we do not necessarily have grant rounds. We accept applications at any time, but we expect them to be in by July 1st of each year. This program is a little different than most of the programs. We don't get an annual appropriation. We take your applications, we submit them to the Forest Service, and these are all, they are judged and selected nationally. So it is a nationally competitive program. We've been seeing an appropriation for Forest Legacy that's somewhere between $50 and $60 million annually, but that's nationally. And our projects are generally 15 to 20 projects annually funded, and there are about 48 states and 3 territories involved in the program. It is a very competitive program. So, so yay, but that's not to discourage you, but let me just say that it is a great program if you have a big project, if you have a complicated project, if you have a group of projects that you could package into a single kind of project with many tracks, this may be the program for you. And please call me or look at our website for that. Now, more good news. Yeah, most of these programs, with the exception of ARM, require a match. The match for Forest Legacy is 75-25. So you may be looking for $3 million for a project, but your match is not going to be another $3 million. It's going to be something less than that, right? So so that's the good news. There are a lot of criteria for this program nationally. They look at 3 different categories: importance, strategic, and threat. In the importance category, they look at many things, the quality of that forest land being one, but other things that they look at include, watersheds and important drinking water areas. So certainly the projects that you may be thinking about today could fit very nicely into a Forest Legacy program project. I think that right now that's all that I will say about the program. Certainly, if you have questions about the program, call me. It is complicated. Talk to Brian Hotz. His organization has gone through this several times. Dwayne Hyde knows all about forest legacy projects. We don't encourage, although it's open for landowners to apply, we don't encourage landowners to apply. We encourage them to partner with some sort of agent like a land trust or a conservation commission, those folks who are much better versed in land protection, because it tends to be complicated. So with that, I will sit down. If you have questions for me later, I will be around.
And thank you, Susan. And next we'll hear from Susan, who's been on the New Hampshire easement staff at the Natural Resources Conservation Service at USDA since 2007. And we'll talk about a couple of the programs that are in the handout.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. As Paul said, I'm Sue Knight. I'm with the NRCS, which is an agency in the Department of Agriculture. The Farm Bill authorizes NRCS to administer what's called the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. In that program, there are several conservation easements that are administered across the country, but New Hampshire uses primarily two of those: wetland reserve easements and agricultural land easements, or we refer to those as ALE and WRE. Both of them are permanent in nature, although the wetland reserve easements are authorized for 30 years. But because of somewhat limited funding, we've opted in this state to offer only permanent easements under WRE. These are on private lands only. The wetland reserve easements are an agreement between NRCS and the landowner directly. There is no third-party sponsorship. The federal government holds the easement, and there is no match required. And if you look at the handout that Paul included in your folders, it focuses, it talks primarily about what the national focus of the wetland reserve easements were, and that was primarily a waterfowl habitat program when it was developed. First authorized by the 1985 Farm Bill, it was called the Wetland Reserve Program. And again, it was primarily for waterfowl habitat and the restoration of lands that had been altered, wetlands that had been altered for the purposes of commodity ag production. But there are many, many land eligibility criteria available under that program. In New Hampshire, the most commonly used criteria that we have is riparian land. Anything that's within 300 feet of a river or stream is considered riparian land, and the program requires a 50-50 wetland upland or riparian land upland land eligibility criteria. We can waive that and include more than 50% upland if there's a species of concern, such as wood turtle, bog turtle, New England cottontail, and we've done that with coordination between the Fish and Wildlife Service and New Hampshire Fish and Game to take wetland reserve easements on parcels that have significantly more than 50% upland. The agricultural land easements are held by a third party, such as a local land trust or a conservation commission. Landowners do not apply to NRCS directly for those. They work through the easement holder, and there is a 50% non-federal match required for those. The thing that I find most exciting about this program is the fact that the wetland reserve easements do not require match, although we love to leverage federal monies if we can to make our funds go further. The wetland reserve easements, like I said, are permanent in nature, held by NRCS, held by the federal government. It's a boilerplate deed template, but within that deed template, there is a water rights exhibit that can be developed as part of the easement that allows for potential source water withdrawal in the future on a piece of permanently protected land, which is really kind of exciting. And it's a good match for this program. The wetland reserve easements also require restoration. So any resource concerns that we identify when we're in the process of ranking those parcels, that may make those parcels eligible are mitigated or restored through wetland reserve easement funds. Again, 100% is paid for by the wetland reserve easements. But we do have on our ranking sheets the ability to allow priority, to increase the priority of parcels that do have leveraged funds, even though it's not a requirement. But if we've got somebody that comes in and is working with a municipality and someone wants to leverage either a portion of the restoration or a portion of the easement acquisition costs, that certainly increases the ranking of those parcels, the potential ranking of those parcels. And also, we do encourage the transfer of land from private landowners post easement to a public entity or a nonprofit. So we do have a lot of lands that are eased, again, private landowners only. The easement's conducted with a private landowner, and then the fee is transferred either to a municipality or to a local land trust. That makes it much easier for us as far as stewardship in the future goes, and does provide opportunities, again, like I said, for potential, not just source water protection, but maybe source water withdrawal on some of those protected lands in the future. So I'm pretty excited about the opportunity. We usually have one ranking round per year. Our funds are allocated on an annual basis, and the ranking cutoff depends on when Congress decides to give us all of our money. So this year it was a bit of a challenge with the continuing resolutions. We got little snippets and drips and drabs, but we now have all of our funds. We have announced the ranking cutoff for this year and have taken all the applications that we're going to take for this year. So the next round won't happen until the 2019 federal fiscal year, which starts October 1st. Unfortunately, this is the last year of the 2014 Farm Bill, so I'm not sure what the future of these easement programs will look like in the new Farm Bill. Hopefully, fingers crossed, and with everybody lobbying for the right thing, hopefully we'll get additional funds. We have averaged about $5 million a year between the two programs historically over the last 5-year Farm Bill period. So hopefully we'll see that continue. Any questions? No? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And Dia is going to talk about two programs. You've no doubt heard of Moose Plate, but maybe you didn't know where that money goes or how it gets there. Dia is going to talk about the Moose Plate program and also about a program of the Great Bay Resource Protection Partnership for funding land transaction costs.
Hi, everybody. So I know you all have a Moose Plate, right? And you give your extra $30, which we thank you for. Those funds go into a dedicated pot of money that go to 5 separate state agencies. And the New Hampshire Conservation Committee administers one of the grant programs using those Moose Plate funds, and that is the program I'm going to talk about today. It's a relatively small grant program compared to all the others that you just heard about. We have around $250,000 to $300,000 a year to give out annually. Grants tend to range between $7,000 up to $24,000. And qualifying projects, there are 6 categories. You can go on the website and read them all, but one of those categories is land conservation. And it has turned out to be quite popular the past several years. That Moose Plate, even though it's a relatively small amount of money, it really helps with all the different sources that you've been hearing about. It's paired well with LCHIP. Sounds like a fine wine. With LCHIP, it pairs well. With ARB, it really is delightful, and even with NRCS programs. Susan, we haven't really paired up yet, but maybe. Eligible applicants, range of applicants are eligible: county conservation districts, municipalities, nonprofits, including land trusts. This program also allows for scouting groups and public and private school groups, and county cooperative extension agencies as well. The applications for this next grant round will be available by July 1st, due mid-September. We're looking at September 14th to be announced. Decisions are by December 1st, and by the following year, between March and June, grant agreements are approved. This is a reimbursement grant program similar to LCHIP. So you finish your task, you show the documentation, you get your money. One of the criteria in this eligibility for what makes a good project are conservation priorities. And I just want to bring that up because water resources is in there. So I think it might be a very nice pairing with this new grant program. And we'd be excited to see some of these projects come forward. So please call me if you have a project, and I can give you whatever input I'm able to in terms of what the committee's funded in the past and what would be good components to add to your application. So I'm doing a double header. And I just want to mention that there are, I know Brian Hotz has been very popular today. You've been mentioned in almost every single presentation, so I'm compelled to mention you again. But there are regional conservation partnerships throughout the state, and the Great Bay Partnership has a transaction grant program, but so does Merrimack and Q2C. So if you're doing a land conservation project, hop on those websites and see if you can get some of your transaction costs paid for. I administered the Great Bay Partnership's transaction grant program. We just so happen to have a grant round open right now. I encourage folks, if you're in the 42 towns of the coastal watershed, to go to our website. We just finished our webinar yesterday, but the webinar should be posted by Monday. Again, call me with any questions. The Partnerships Grant Program, we have two grant programs. We have one, we have a mini little grant program for appraisals. Someone likes to call it gambling money, but it's a very good gamble. It's to help fund 50% of appraisals to get a project started. And I'm looking at the town of Barrington, you come in for an appraisal, and then the second grant program is the full-blown, you're going to complete the project. And that is the, that amount goes up to $20,000. So a lot of folks come in, they get an appraisal done, they get the landowner interested, and that does move into a full conservation project. We're trying to do once a year on this grant round. I don't know if that's going to be possible. Our funding's through New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. So we have this May 4th deadline. We may or may not have a fall grant round, but we will have another grant round in 2019. And stay tuned, go to the website when you want to see when the grant rounds will be. Any questions? Thank you.
Thanks, Tia. Finally, right in the Source Water Protection Program at DES, we've had a small grants program for a long time, just our regular local source water protection grants, grants up to $20,000 that don't require any non-federal match. And those monies can be used for transaction costs for land conservation. So that money cannot be used to acquire land or easements, but it can be used for transaction costs. And that's run by Pierce Rigrod, who I think I saw in the room earlier. Not here anymore. Okay. Incidentally, Pierce also runs the, it's the largest annual source water protection conference in New England, in the country. All right, thanks, Kyra. Well, that's good to have that endorsement from EPA. Thank you. The largest annual source water protection conference in the country. We have it in New Hampshire, and there's some agendas in the ante room right outside the auditorium. So if you're interested in learning more about source water protection in general, register for that. It's coming up in just a couple weeks. And I think now we're basically ready to take questions on this program and any of the programs, any of the potential matching programs that we heard from. I do think I just wanted to make one comment, which is it's my impression that the advisory commission wants to see applicants working on match. So even if you're not successful at getting the overmatch, the more than 50%, I think they really want to see you working, beating the bushes, being creative, bringing in as many funding sources as possible, even if it's just a few thousand here and a few thousand there. So think about these programs. Put your hand down, Rick. Think about these sources and try to be creative.
I just want to remind you all, it is being recorded, so please repeat the question.
Thank you, Rick. Rick wanted me to repeat the questions. Yes, sir.
Question, the tidal
drift aquifers that are included as eligible lands. Do those need to be tied to a public water supply system, or can they be approached independently?
So the question is whether, in order to be eligible under the program, do these stratified drift aquifers, the high yield stratified drift aquifers, do they need to be connected to a public water system? The answer is no, they don't. Under the old program, they wouldn't have been eligible. That is, under Holly's program, they would not have been eligible, but under this program, they are eligible just as potential future sources. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'm from the Athens Conservation Commission, so I'd like to thank you for using our town sign in one of your slides. When we approach landowners to maybe buy open space, they kind of like to have funding committed, and it sounds like from what I heard today, before you commit to funding, you'd kind of like to have a purchase and sale in place. How would we approach, it's a chicken and egg thing. What do you do?
So the question is whether it's necessary to have a purchase and sale agreement in place before applying for funds. I think that's essentially what the question is. It's not necessary. You would get extra points. If you look at the scoring criteria, you can see that it's extra points, but you don't need to first have that purchase and sale agreement. Yes, sir.
Jamie, I'm going to get Groundwater. I applaud everything that you're doing in terms of source water protection. And I've been at the stakeholder meetings from the beginning. And I'm so concerned that when you buy land to protect water, groundwater resources in particular, you don't know what lands are significant and critical and strategically located to protect. And you're potentially buying lands that are not sufficient to protect that source. So we represent a number of clients who have lost production wells because they didn't have a source water protection plan in place, but more importantly, they didn't know where the recharge was coming into those wells. We have probably another dozen municipalities that are seeking to develop and identify recharge areas to the public water supply sources so that they can protect those resources down the road. Now, the way I read this, and I was not able to be here this morning, is that there is nothing in this plan to identify the groundwater recharge areas for production wells in the state, nor is there any money available for groundwater monitoring. So could you just address that? Is that something I'm missing?
Okay, so that's Jamie Emery from Emery and Garrett, and he applauds what we're doing. Thank you, Jamie. So Jamie is pointing out that from the way we've described the program today, grants are not available to do delineations of wellhead protection areas or do delineations of areas that are actually contributing water to public water supply sources. Right, Jamie? That's basically it. Okay, now we do our small local source water protection grant programs, the $20,000 grants have always been available for that. That's not enough money to carry off that sort of thing. And this being version 1.0 of the source water piece or the non-construction piece, Jamie's right, that's not explicitly eligible. I think the door is going to be open a lot wider in the next version of this grant program next year to do other things. Okay, sure. And Clark is going to tell me that I'm right. Okay.
Do that, but everything you said is accurate. There was at the very last meeting of the commission, which I'm trying to remember the exact date. I think it was November 12th. I could be off. We did bring up a number of stakeholder comments about areas in which a small amount of grant money for studies up front could really get a much better outcome on larger projects on the back end. And that was one of the areas that was highlighted. In particular, the focus there was on very small systems who might not know what the protection area for their source is, or for towns that might be less well off. And there was a focus on setting up some sort of a engineering fund that could be doled out to either impoverished or less challenged towns and small water utilities so that they could go off and do the studies to make a proper application that could get us really good outcomes. And you're right, there are a number of little niche areas where town doesn't have the money, or a condo association, whoever the water system, they don't have the money to go off and do the work, or worse yet, as it was highlighted, they don't have the people. You know, a lot of these are volunteer committees, they're running an organization, they're working really hard. If we could give them 40, 60, 80 hours of engineering, that could be put to really beneficial use to get a much better outcome. And in particular, the area of knowing what is your real wellhead protection, that was highlighted. The ask from the commission was that we spend part of this year coming up with a better definition of what are all those tasks, what do we think the budget is necessary to do those tasks, and then in the fall session when the commission comes together to look at the next year's operating budget, that might be something we'd roll in the contracts part of the operating budget. So there is a commitment to look at that and to try and come up with the proper funding for it. But part of what we need to help is defining that more clearly over the next year. It's not in 1.0, as Paul said, but there's a commitment during 1.0 to sort of figure out how it could be better done in 2.0.
I don't want it to be limited in my testimony to the stakeholder meetings. The discussion was not limited to small communities. We had a number of very substantial cities and municipalities in New Hampshire who did not benefit from our groundwater withdrawal permitting process, that have wells online that are threatened by groundwater contaminants that I'm referring to. So I want to make sure that this is not just something limited to small communities and small condos. This is significantly more concerned.
Right. So the comment was that there are large utilities and large municipalities who have this problem, and they could benefit from this also. What I got from the commission and the subcommittee was, if you're a large town, you ought to be investing in knowing what your water system is and then asking for money to help go do the work you need. There was a very strong understanding that for smaller utilities, smaller systems, and towns with greater need. So basically what I'm saying is the commitment right now is, let's go figure out what that portion is, what that needs to be funded. And that's where there was a strong interest of getting that put into the next round. Funding larger towns who generally have the resources to go do what they ought to go to protect their source. I did not get that there was as strong of a desire to get that pulled into 2.0.
I just want to make sure that we're not buying land to protect areas that aren't within the source for protection, specifically at contact with each other. That's essentially because you don't want to spend money on millions of dollars of property that isn't focused on what needs to be.
Right. So that comment was again just a concern that we're not spending money to conserve land that isn't really in a wellhead recharge area, and I think getting to the point that some of the delineations that we have are not based on an awful lot of site-specific information, and so some of the wellhead protection areas that we currently have and that would be eligible, some portions there might not actually be protecting the well, and so it would be good to be sure that we're protecting the right land going forward. Okay, other questions? Anna.
I just have a question regarding the eligibility criteria. So the land identified by public water system or municipality as important to protect in the present or future. Would that also qualify if it's owned by a water district? It's not owned by the municipality. It's a water district, so it's in, say, 2 or 3 towns.
Right.
Portions of the town.
So the question has to do with the eligibility criteria, and specifically that sort of third category that I mentioned, the maximum flexibility one, which basically is that if a municipality or water system has gone through a methodical process to identify important water supply lands for present or future, then we would consider that land to be eligible. And Anna's question was whether it would be eligible if it's already owned by the water system, but not conserved. And the answer is yes, as long as it's not permanently protected, it would be eligible. Okay. And Brian. Dwayne.
Dwayne Hyde of the Southeast Land Trust. I just wanted to clarify how this program works with agricultural lands, or whether agricultural lands would be eligible for this program.
Right, so the question is whether agricultural lands are eligible, and they are, as long as they're undeveloped. I think that we would be looking for making sure that the land is indeed going to be protecting the source. That perhaps some best management practices are in place. Our standard easement language or model easement language has to do with having certain management plans in place. So I think we'd be going with that. Dwayne, no, Brian. Brian.
You just mentioned the standard easement language. Will it have a requirement for municipal water draw from that property that gets funded?
So the question is whether we would require in the easements to have a reserved right to withdraw water from the property. I don't think we have a firm answer for that. It's the best answer I can give you. Yeah. We don't require it now. I don't think we would. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Paul, if I could just say, we do encourage the land trusts going forward that they have consulted the municipality as to whether they want to have a future well. That has been standard practice. Many times the municipality said, no, we don't care. But we do ask that land trusts make that approach.
Okay, and so Holly has reminded me that under the existing program, we will make sure that the applicant is checked with the municipality to see if they have any interest in withdrawing water. Mm-hmm. Right, well, I guess, there are areas that can protect the water source even if water is not, even if you're not sinking a well on that property. So we have, Gary was just pointing out that the whole point here is source water protection after all. And Mike.
Oh, you mentioned in terms of eligible lands, you said uncontaminated. We know that we've got PFAS all over the state that let the background of. So I'm just wondering, what's the definition of uncontaminated?
I think we'd be, okay, Mike's question was one of the eligibility criteria for eligible land is that it be uncontaminated. I think we'd be relying primarily on the ambient groundwater quality standards to make sure there isn't an exceedance of ambient groundwater quality standards. Or if there is, then there's a plan in place to remediate that. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Robert Nash, Conservation Commission. And one of the criteria, number 7, is frontage on rivers and streams, and within 5 miles of the intake. Is that 5 miles of the control place or 5 miles along the winding river?
So the question is whether the eligibility criterion that has to do with land in a water supply watershed that's within 5 miles of the intake is the 5 miles measured along the water or simply in a straight line, and it's measured in a straight line. A straight line from the intake to an arc drawn from that point. Okay, Kyra.
I just want to mention another potential source of funds, which is our Connecticut Regional Conservation Partnership Program land funds that are being administered through a steering committee that assists across 6 states. So if you're in the western part of the state in the Connecticut River watershed, please talk to me, Kyra Jacobs, with the Source Water Protection Program in the PA, because I convene that or represent the drinking water, source water programs for all 6 states that are in the watershed.
Okay, that's Kyra Jacobs from EPA Region 1, and she's reminding us that there's a resource conservation partnership focused on the Connecticut River watershed. So if there's any lands in that part of the state, Kyra is the one to follow up on for the potential to tap that, that funding source. William.
Sorry, William Abbott from Chocolate Valley. One more question about this uncontaminated versus contaminated water. Are we going off of existing data that's represented in your one-stop mapper, or are we required to do some water quality sampling as part of the conservation project?
So William's question has to do with, again, the criterion having to do with uncontaminated land and whether any investigation such as water quality sampling would be required in order to determine that. If there isn't any suggestion in terms of past or current land use or any known issues, we would not expect you to be going out and doing any sort of investigation. But if you know of anything that indicates that it might be contaminated, we would expect there to be some kind of site investigation. Mike.
Mike Speltz, Londonderry Conservation Commission. How would you handle a parcel that lies partly within the eligibility area and partly without?
So the question is how we handle a parcel that is, a portion of the parcel is eligible land and a portion is not. Well, we look at the total project cost. And if, let's say, 50% of the project were eligible land, then we would look at 50% of the total project cost as being eligible costs under this program. Dwayne.
Well, can you just speak to the legal interest that DES would have in any one of these lasting legal interests under the program?
Yeah, I'd have to refer to the guidelines document to be sure to get that one right. Okay. Right, so the question is what legal interest DES would have in the property. And again, I don't know that off the top of my head. I'd have to refer to the guidelines document. I think it's pretty clear in there. Mm-hmm. Third-party right of enforcement is what I'm being told. Okay. Other questions or comments, suggestions, etc.? Mike.
As a comment, a lot of us have been in New Hampshire a long time, and we probably forget the fact that there's a thing called the New Hampshire Way. And this day and this program, I think, is an excellent demonstration of the fact that we live in a small state where we all work together, pull all of our grant programs together. We have a staff who's willing to engage directly with people, and so at least I think I can speak for her to say, well, we appreciate what we've done there.
Thank you, Mike. Mike is saying we're doing things the New Hampshire way here today, and I think that sums it up. So, okay, in the back there.
Well, you mentioned any groundwater standards and evaluate contamination of the process. What metrics would you choose for evaluating surface water sources?
So Ian's question had to do with, again, uncontaminated, that criterion for the land to be eligible. And again, it's the land and the groundwater that needs to be uncontaminated. I don't think a non-supporting a water quality classification is something that would cause us to say that the land is ineligible. Clark. Sure. Wrap up.
So one, we very much appreciate, I was able to stick in some of the stakeholder meeting groups and getting our rules formed, and it was very much appreciated how engaged this community was. It's nice to see the water community joining in. And like I said, think of this as a quick chance for speed dating, grab a partner on the way out, get to know each other, start exchanging information. I also wanted to share the thanks for Paul. The amount of work that's gone into this. When we first started this out, the goal was that in 18 months, we'd be able to run a round of grants. 6 months later, you're at the kickoff meeting for the first round of grants. And it's because of people like Paul and Rick and Jana, who's sitting in the back, who have, every time the commission's had a new idea, turned it into an application that they could sit down and really evaluate. It really has made a huge difference, and I can't thank them enough. Big point to make again is, while we've given you guidelines and recommendations of what the commission is looking for, in the end, what the commission's looking for is really great projects. If you come in with something and it's $501,000, the commission will take a look at it. If it's got slightly different considerations as far as the property line, the commission can look at it. What the commission wanted to keep was absolute flexibility, that if you come up with a great project and it just doesn't conform to what we came up with as guidelines in version 1.0, they still kept the freedom they can award. So if you're butting up right against some edge and you just can't quite get over that edge, write it up, make your pitch. To some degree, what they're really wanting to see is what's a really innovative way to go do really good outcomes. Dude, that was great. Really create great outcomes in the state of New Hampshire that benefit us, especially from the standpoint of protecting our drinking water going forward. And if you've got a novel idea and it doesn't conform to exactly what we wrote up in our first try at these, please submit it. We want to either figure out that it's a better project and we'll change our guidelines to match it, or the commission may just say, we like this project, leave the guidelines as they are, but we're going to award it anyway. So that's the last thing I want to get across. We've given you guidelines, and honestly, if you got a project where you need $4 million and it's 90% of the project is grant, it's highly unlikely to get awarded. But if it's the best project on the face of the planet, maybe it will. We don't know. The commission really wants to hear from you what innovative opportunities are out there to come up with good outcomes. So thank you for your participation. And again, thank you, Paul, and everybody else who helped in setting this up. Have a great day.